What's going on, Temple Conference? My name is Harrison Wheeler, and today we're going to talk about the narrative thread, connecting people, ideas, and design in your organization. The reality of today is that one of the biggest challenges is having a clear direction for organizations. And this is rightfully so, right? There's so many challenges that we're going through. Whether thinking about it from the changing landscape of privacy and regulation around it, to tightening budgets due to macroeconomic conditions, thinking about how AI plays a role in terms of consumer adoption, distributed teams, the list goes on. Organizations have had to pivot and make changes more times than ever. And sometimes these things get lost moving up and down the chain. The reality is that we've been asked to do more with less. And so when thinking about this idea around narratives, one of the things that I challenge myself is how can we align people at scale? How can this be an inherent part of our design process? And how can we influence strategy just given the reality of the constraints that we're operating in? And so narratives play a really fundamental role in terms of, again, grounding in reality, right? We're not moving into this world where we're pitching a protagonist antagonist or having a climax in the story. While these things are extremely great, that's not necessarily going to bring the attention of cross-functional partners that ultimately want to understand what the adoption is going to be like, as well as the revenue and impact on the business. And so today, I'm really kind of breaking my presentation down into four areas, right? The why, how to construct a narrative, opportunities to align teams, and how to apply it to your design process. Let's get started. Just want to give you all a quick introduction. Again, my name is Harrison. I'm a director of design at LinkedIn on our ads platform. LinkedIn is a very diversified business when we start thinking of our consumer application, which most of you all have had an opportunity to use, whether you're posting content or looking for jobs. But we also have enterprise experiences as well on the marketing side, sales, and recruiting. Creates really unique experiences in terms of how our members interplay from connecting and networking to doing their jobs on the daily. I've always loved thinking about how we can affect design at scale. Before I was at LinkedIn, I also worked at a startup company where I was an early employee, and we worked our way up into 200 employees. And that company ultimately was bought by Zendesk. So in my heart, I really do love approaching problems with a sense of design, especially when it comes to the experience, right? The way that we operate internally plays a role in terms of how people interact with our product externally. I've also had a unique opportunity of managing a team that's distributed across 7 time zones in the world. So you can imagine aligning a team on different time zones with different contexts and different cultural backgrounds can be a challenge. And this is where I really find the opportunity of thinking about narrative to align our group of talented designers. So let's get into narrative development. So, narrative development is important because it can help other lines of businesses that may be unfamiliar. We are working with a wide range of cross-functional teams on initiatives in many different lenses, whether it be through marketing, support, executive leadership, research, engineering, and this isn't even exhaustive. So there are so many people that are going to walk into a room with many different lenses, or there's also strategy in terms of which their roles are contingent on. It's really important to make sure that teams are aligned. If teams aren't aligned, it can create a lot of friction, right? Whether it be through, your calendar filling up with a ton of meetings to sync, or really long Slack threads. None of these things are great, only to turn out having another meeting where people still aren't aligned. And so strong narratives are inclusive, right? They give everyone insight in understanding the need so they can contribute accordingly. This empowers people to be able to contribute to the broader strategy versus having it be a top down approach, or even at the top, not understanding what's happening at an IC level. So, this is the fun part. Let's get into constructing a narrative. And so, constructing a narrative is really important. One of the things that I want to tell you is that there are four main components in terms of how I think about constructing the narrative. Number one, jobs to be done is a huge part of how we think about our narratives at LinkedIn. And our research team has spent a couple of years doing extensive research, particularly around our marketers and how they use the product. For all intents purposes, we won't dive into this too much. At least this will give you an idea of where to start. The second piece is our audience. So who is trying to complete these jobs to be done? The third piece is context, right? In which area are they completing this job to be done? And the fourth is going to be thinking about that continuum over time. So as I mentioned, jobs to be done is a framework that helps businesses understand their jobs or tasks, and customers are hiring them to accomplish those goals. There's so much of this information on the internet and a ton of really great books. I encourage you all to explore that. Today, we're going to be focusing particularly on a functional job to be done, but there are other areas that we could also dive into as well. Also, when it comes to audience, as I mentioned before, it's a group of people who are using your product or service. For context, it can be a single surface or multiple surface in which your audience is trying to achieve their job. And finally, it comes down to the continuum. So what is the progression of the experience as someone is trying to complete their job? So this is the fun part. I'm going to show you how maybe you can put together an outline. And this outline will give you just an idea of how all these things start to interplay with each other. Later in the presentation, I'll provide a link where you all can actually download it and work through it yourself. So if we look at this outline, at the top, we start out with the job to be done. Following that, we have our audience who is trying to achieve the job, the context, and what the audience is doing. And so what you see over here, you see a progression of touch points, right? Initially, during interaction, what happens if their input is wrong, what happened over time, and what happens in the post experience. I'm going to give some credit here to the Microsoft Hacks Toolkit. Microsoft has done a lot of work in creating some design frameworks around artificial intelligence. And I found that particularly when we start thinking about the continuum, some of those items are really relevant to this. We've also applied this to some of our workshops, and it's created some really great opportunities and in-depth thinking for our design team. So I encourage you to check it out. But before then, let's see how we might fill this out. And so for the example that I'm going to provide, I'm sure you all are familiar with online or mobile grocery sites, or online grocery shopping apps. And we're going to take an example out of or page out of that experience. So the job to be done is to quickly and easily find items that you need without going to the grocery store, right? Our audience is working professionals. The context is an e-commerce experience. And I've gone ahead and actually filled out what the audience is doing. So you can see examples of how we might think about these things. So initially, they might be putting together a list of items to buy. If they don't have the right credit card information, when would we prompt them? When we think about the process of delivery that's happening over time, how are we notifying or how are we engaging with them? These are really great opportunities to start thinking through this as a group. And this is actually a great ideation phase as you all are starting to work through this. When you layer on some of this hacks guideline toolkit, there's also some really great considerations that is in that workbook that I would encourage you all to leverage. Now, we can actually, now that we have all this information, we can actually easily put this into a narrative. One of the things that I want to I outline here and expose to you all, we're not looking at solutioning here, right? And that's the key part. We're not creating a ton of bias. We're creating a format in which we can really start to ideate on ideas, again, without having too much bias. Here's an example of what that narrative might look like. And so we've identified the person as Lucy or the audience as Lucy. We're not going to go through this full story. Included a QR code that you can scan and check out the full story. So you can see how this progressively translate into this narrative. Now, now that I've gotten you all an idea of how to write these narratives, let's think about how we can align teams. And I'm going to sort of break down how all of this starts to play a role into the process. One of the reasons why I think starting from a narrative is extremely important is because, again, we're using familiar language. We're also using familiar language not only in the context of when we're designing, but we're using the language in a context when we're thinking about planning as well. And so narrative becomes the mission of the organization. It becomes the fabric of our discussions and our conversations. And you can kind of think about this in sort of three areas to begin with, right? There's a wider array, but at the top of mind for me, it comes down to OKRs, aligning, your strategic partners, and thinking about how we are thinking about our priorities in terms of where we are going to be putting our effort and our resources. And so in the next set of slides, I'm going to kind of tell you how I've applied those in the organization and some high level examples. So OKRs are really important, right? Because number one, they create focus and scope creep. And so when we have this narrative and when we have this layout of the jobs, as well as the interaction and touch points, it allows us to understand we are playing within this realm. We also know inherently if we're solving that job, we are creating value for the customer. And inherently, we also understand that that can be tied to a key result. So what you see on the right here is an example of something like this, right? Easing friction from sign up to adding items in a cart. We saw that that is a key touch point. Now we can say, you know what, there's a key result that we're aiming for in reduction of average time to add the item in cart. And we'll just hypothetically say, this is a part of the growth initiative. But one of the things here that I appreciate about thinking about these OKRs is that, again, you can tie it back to that larger narrative. You're now giving people a sense of ownership and understanding of how that ladders up to a broader direction. When we think about organizational alignment, I sort of spoke to these before earlier, right? But everyone has a cohesive narrative that they understand from top to bottom. Additionally, design and research leaders are consistent in language, and experienced leads can own broader experience and facilitate touch points. So I'll give you an example. I've got 3 amazing principal designers in our organization, and we've aligned 3 different narratives in our organization that are a part of our strategic priorities. They are now empowered to own those. There are a number of experiences within their particular strategic initiatives, but inherently they understand and can start to facilitate discussions around craft. They can also find a way to align our different experience touch points. And so this is really huge because now we're getting to a point where, again, this is starting to become a, what I like to say, embodied in our organization, where we're keeping our members and the value that they're getting out of our experience firsthand. This is my favorite part about this, and it's prioritization. I'm sure you all are familiar in this world where you've got so many requests happening in terms of projects, shipping MVPs. I think the question is, how do these things align to sort of the greater goal? But what if I told you having this narrative now allows you to take a lens in terms of understanding what are the most impactful initiatives to prioritize? This allows you to create better focus with limited resources. Additionally, when you start thinking about this narrative approach in these different touch points, you can actually start to identify where there are potential gaps in your existing experiences as well. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how this can help you show up a lot better in an organization, as well as get your organization moving in lockstep direction. Now, this is my favorite part, the design process. And there are so many different ways that this starts to empower your team to really supercharge a lot of their design methods, right? And supercharge even your partners. So there are really kind of four areas, I think, again, top of mind. Number one, workshops. Number two, sprints, voice and tone, and this wide world of AI. How do we apply this lens of AI to the narrative? Well, again, when we start thinking about the jobs to be done, we know what people are trying to do. And now we can start thinking about this from the lens of how AI can start to enhance that. So here are a few examples of things that we've done in the past, right? So number one, narrative alignment with cross-functional partners. I will say this, narrative development should never really be done in a silo. With your business partners, I think it's important for them to feel heard. And I've done so many different presentations on the importance of facilitating collaborative feedback or collaborative cycles. So this is a really good opportunity for you to start driving, this narrative development with your cross-functional partners. Another piece here is how might we sprint based on interactions. So this is a really great opportunity again to engage your design team in ways that are really grounded in this narrative. They're not necessarily going to be tackling the whole narrative, and they don't have to, but they can. They can actually be focused on specific touch points that we outlined earlier. Additionally, when we start thinking about how squads or pods organize, and this might be centered around your working groups, they can be focused specifically either on the job holistically or split into these different touch points as well. And finally, when we think about the holistic narrative, your content strategy actually has a potential opportunity to start connecting these things together. We understand who the audience is. We can also understand what the goals are. What are the different touch points? And ultimately, again, what that value is. Now, I want to reiterate, for the purpose of this, is that the research of our jobs were informed early. So we didn't have the need to evaluate every single experience that we shipped. The idea here is that we are confident based upon the jobs that have been prescribed, and prescribed is important. But the reason that we want to make sure that I want to make sure that we call that out is that, again, with limited resources, we just can't afford to do evaluative research every single time. So the idea here allow teams to be able to have a hypothesis moving into their products and really drive an MVP and learn from it. And so that's really kind of the piece I want to make sure that I emphasize for this group here when you're approaching this. You're starting to streamline some of your workflows. So again, maybe the jobs to be done and the research is, more foundational, and it may create a lot of work in the beginning, but it allows the team to be more nimble and flexible later on. So in closing, look, narratives are inclusive. Narratives happen over time. They can be applied to an array of design methods, as I just went over, and ultimately they can enable organizational excellence. This is something in my head that's probably taken about 3 months, and in 6 months, we'll have a lot of learning, and hopefully we're going to really start to see this built into the fabric of the things that we do. But ultimately, you don't have to take my word for it. Apply it to your organization, learn from it, the end state may look totally different than what I'm doing. And that's the beauty of any sort of design method that, we're doing, right? We want to make sure that they're applied within the context and well as the organizational dynamics of where you're at. So keep that in mind. You can find the narrative worksheet that I just went over on the Figma community at figma.com/@HMWHEELE. You can also subscribe to my podcast, Technically Speaking, at technicallyspeakinghw.com. I interview BIPOC designers from around the world where we talk about their triumphs, their struggles, and what gets them up in the morning. Be sure to check it out. There's so many amazing episodes and so many topics that we talk about at the intersection of design, technology, and entrepreneurship. Once again, thank you so much and best of luck. Feel free to follow with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear about your success in applying your narratives to the organization.